So the moon goddess, whenever I teach about Coyolxauhqui, I have a tendency to introduce her like as though an archaeologist or an anthropologist were looking at the work. And then I say, what evidence do we have that this person really existed, or what evidence do we have about who she was? And who she was, we only, before 1978, I'll tell you a little story from 1978. Before 1978, all we had was text from early colonial sources. You see, before 1521, the Aztec and other Mesoamericans wrote their stories and everything that was important to them in books. They had screenfold manuscripts. And so the Maya actually had hieroglyphic writing, but the Aztec wrote basically in calendar glyphs and in images. And so before 1521, the pre-contact period, they would write all the stories. Most of these manuscripts, unfortunately, were lost in the wars of conquest. After 1521, fortunately, Aztec scribes endeavored to continue their manuscript making tradition, but this time they used alphabetic text in Latin, with Latin script from the Europeans brought, and then they wrote stories. And we learned that the Coyolxauhqui, and she's in various ethnographic sources from after 1521, that explains to us that the Coyolxauhqui was the sister, there was a story of a family. All these ethnohistoric sources say, and these ethnohistoric sources include the Florentine Codex, Chronicle X, even Diego Duran has this story. So various sources corroborate and tell us the same story. Some of the elements are a little bit different, but most coincide in the major elements, which are as follows. This family lived at a mountain called Coatepec, and at Coatepec, Coatlicue, the mother, who happens to be an Aztec earth goddess representing fertility and motherhood and things like that, a creator goddess, if you will. She lived at Coatepec, which literally means in Nahuatl, the lingua franca of the Aztecs, Snake Mountain. And they lived there, and one time she was sweeping, and from this sweeping, she found that a feather ball started in the air. She grabbed it and put it in her bosom, and she miraculously became pregnant. Now, a lot of students say that resembles the story of the Virgin Mary. And I like to point out that yes, there seem to be similarities, but I argue but I argue that for Mesoamericans, the idea of birds and feathers is they're actually pollinating, or they're actually putting life. So to me, it's actually very Mesoamerican manner of saying that she became impregnated. So she becomes impregnated, and then Coyolxauhqui becomes jealous of the baby is going to be born, and what she does is that she immediately starts collecting an army. And they say that she began to organize an army with innumerable numbers of soldiers. And for Mesoamericans to say a huge amount is like 400 or something like that. So then she does that, but there's always someone who was an informant, a traitor, and goes and tells the story to Coatlicue. And Coatlicue becomes really upset. But then the fetus in her womb says, "Do not be afraid, mother, I will save you." And then the day when Coyolxauhqui and her army are going to advance to kill Coatlicue and the product of her womb, the informant says they're coming. And then Huitzilopochtli emerges from the womb, fully attired in a warrior's outfit with a scepter and a shield and all the paraphernalia, of a warrior. And then he succeeds in killing Coyolxauhqui, beheading her, and sending her dismembered body, which becomes more dismembered as she tumbles down Coatepec Mountain. And so we scholars used to read that story and thought, okay, so that's a very important story. It's in various ethnohistoric sources. But in 1978, a team of electric workers were digging in Mexico City, and they stumbled upon hard rock. And usually they were expecting watery soil, because Mexico was a city built on water. But later Europeans began to make it drier. And they began to excavate, and they saw that the stone was precisely the stone in El Árbol de la Muerte at the top. And immediately INA was called, and they began to analyze the image, and they couldn't believe that it was Coyolxauhqui. And they understood because Coyolxauhqui has bells on her cheeks, and Coyolxauhqui basically means bells on her cheeks, and that was the glyph for her name. And so art historians were called into the scene, and they began to identify her, and they couldn't believe that, number one, Coyolxauhqui was such an important figure, hence why she was repeated in several sources. Not only that, but she was placed in a prominent place at the bottom of the stairs of the Templo Mayor. The Templo Mayor is one of the holiest precincts for the Aztec Empire, built in Mexico City. And in 1978, that is when the Templo Mayor was excavated, and the ruins of it, because most of the Templo Mayor was built in several stages. Each Tlatoani or speaker would come in later and do additions to the temple. And then the last few additions were almost completely, basically obliterated by the Wars of Conquest from 1519 to 1521, how long it took Europeans to defeat the Aztecs, and they lost hegemony. They don't disappear, but they lost hegemony in the region. And then they begin to excavate the Templo Mayor. We learned so much about the Templo Mayor, but also about this context of Coyolxauhqui. And we learned that she's very significant.